sidder fuldstændig forbarmet i udsigt nu, og så sidder han bare på værelset. Ja. Det giver sådan lidt flashback til sidste gang, der var jo orkan. God efterårsstorm. Det er meget hyggeligt i hvert fald. Så hvis det har de i hvert fald mad og drikker på rigeligt. Det er meget værre. Han er nummer 3 af
Good morning, everyone. We're short of one presenter, so we are running a bit late, but we will start, and hopefully we will have the last presenter with us. If not, then after the break. Good morning, and welcome to the last day of the conference. The last but not least theme for today is transfers and trafficking, the human cost of broken dreams. And even if transfers and trafficking are not that much in the public debate as doping and match fixing, we do believe there's a lot of things here to be said and discussed and investigated. There are issues pertaining to the issue of ownership of human beings. There's issue pertaining to the human trafficking, and there's issues pertaining to people striving their whole life to be part of a dubious sporting industry. So it's a great pleasure for me to have some of the most important persons working with this issue in Europe. And I'll present them one by one. They will have their speech, and then we will gather time for a common discussion after having all the presentations. I have just one announcement to do from the conference organizers, and that's a very important message. So if you're going to the party tonight and don't have a ticket, you should go and see the organizers. And if you are not going and happen to have a ticket, you should also go. But we hope to see a lot of you for the party tonight, but go and get it organized with the organizer. So the first presenter today is Professor Niko Besnier. Niko Besnier is the principal investigator of a European Research Council advanced grant. Niko Besnier is very well known in anthropology. He's the editor-in-chief of American Ethnologist, and it's a great pleasure when people outside of the ordinary or what is thought of as sports science start investigating sport. Niko and his group of PhD and postdoc students are carrying on with a project called Global Sport, investigating issues of sport labor migration in various contexts. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Niko. Please.
Good morning. Which one is it? What is the... Oh, this one? Okay, good, thank you. Since it's 9 a.m. on the last day, allow me to try to entertain you a little bit by introducing you to a small corner of the globe, namely the island kingdom of Tonga in the Southwest Pacific, inhabited by 100,000 people, where I've been conducting anthropological research since 1977, I'm afraid to say, for a cumulative total of now 4 years. But instead of swaying palm trees and beaches, in fact, there are no beaches, I'm going to talk to you about the economy. In this context, there are very few natural resources that can be successfully exploited. In the context of extreme economic precarity, the main source of revenue since the 1960s has been the labor that the country can provide. People migrating overseas, primarily to New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, and sending remittances to families who remain in the islands, for whom these transnational links are central to all aspects of life. Until recently, most Tongans who migrated overseas ended up taking menial jobs in the service and labor sectors of industrial economies. But Tongans have two extraordinary qualities, and here I'm coming to sport: their physical constitution and their absolute passion for rugby. For reasons that are easy to oversimplify and difficult to understand in their full complexity, many young Tongan men and women, like their neighbors Samoans and Fijians, are blessed with some of the most robust physical constitutions in the world. Large bodies that are also astonishingly light on their feet, but as they grow old, particularly prone to terrible obesity and non-communicable diseases. Young men are extraordinarily talented in rugby, which they have been playing since colonial school teachers introduced them in the early 20th century, and which they play as soon as they can walk. In other words, God really created rugby for Tongans and Pacific Islanders. In the 1980s, agents and recruiters for the game in industrial countries began to realize the potential of recruiting Pacific Islanders for their clubs, and Tongans responded with enthusiasm. During my last period of field work in Tonga in the late 2000s, I saw that rugby migrations had acquired a central role in the national economy. In very significant ways, Tonga as a nation is now oriented to the export of young men to the rugby-playing world. This realization led me to set up a project on sport migrations in general, which approaches the subject first and foremost from the perspective of athletes themselves and their societies of origin, and then follows them through their often tortuous journeys. This is the 5-year global sport project funded by the European Research Council, which Sine referred to, with 7 researchers, including 2 young people in the room who will present their work later today, Mark Hahn, and who just returned from a year of fieldwork in Senegal, and Uroš Kovač, who just returned from a year in Cameroon. This is the context in which I will consider 2 key aspects of the contemporary global sports industries, namely the migration of young athletic hopefuls from poorer regions of the world to the industrial nations, and what I will call the life management of those amongst those young men who managed to obtain employment in the sport industries. Both of these aspects are widely considered to be major problems in sport management. But what I will argue is that an understanding of both these problems from the receiving end of sport migration paths may differ in interesting and consequential ways from the perspectives of the places from which the migrant athletes originate. In my conclusion, I will suggest some implications for the management of non-European athletes in European contexts. It is very well known, since the 1980s, the sport industries in the industrial world have come to depend on non-local talent, and this local talent is increasingly harvested in countries of what can be loosely called the Global South, what used to be called the Third World. For example, many rugby teams in major rugby-playing countries of Western Europe, as well as New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, today rely on the formidable brown power of Pacific Island players from the 3 major island countries of Polynesia, namely Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, as well as on men from families who originated from these islands and have grown up in New Zealand and Australia in the last 50 years. Similar remarks can be made about the dependence of soccer football teams of the global north on youthful talent from places like West Africa and South America. In the race for, besides athletic success, financial viability, young talented immigrants represent particularly promising rewards for clubs and teams, be it in terms of their ability to perform on the field or for clubs, for which finance is the main concern, their potential as lucrative transfer to wealthier teams. The trouble is that the demand for talent in the industrial north is having a major impact on the supply side. The so-called football farms of West Africa are multiplying at an exponential rate in countries like Ghana, ranging from official schools run by European clubs to fly-by-night enterprises that promise a great deal and deliver very little. In Tonga, rumors that scouts from France or Japan are about to arrive create anxious excitement among boys and their families in schools and villages. This is, of course, the perfect context for young professional hopefuls to become prey to exploitation, false promises, and predatory schemes. In short, what we have come to known as human trafficking, which since the 1990s has generated somewhat of a moral panic in many of our countries. However, as a member of my research team and other observers have noted, young men are often willing to place their fate into the hands of individuals whom an uninformed observer would identify as a human trafficker, and to do so knowing the potential dangers. Thus, the picture one obtains from spending time with players and the people who surround them is quite different from that which obtains from a more generalist perspective, focused on the structural conditions of recruitment, migration, and travel, and assumes a universal understanding of people as rational individual actors who weigh the potential of a particular form of action against the dangers and base their decisions on this calculation, which of course would militate against risky migrations. But this perspective does not capture the full complexity of what motivates young migrant hopefuls to place their fate in the hands of agents. In many societies of global south, at the potential danger of oversimplifying, overgeneralizing, being dependent is in fact what makes an individual human. Being someone means belonging to someone, and perhaps being connected to multiple others through relationships of dependence, indebtedness, and reciprocity, many of which predates one's emergence as a person. This perspective is partly an effect of culture, in the sense that it shapes how people see themselves in the world and in relation to others. But it is also based on material conditions. When one is poor, aligning oneself to a more powerful other is a very good survival strategy. This more powerful other need not be an individual. It can be the family, one's kinship group at large, or one's neighborhood. Corporate groups of people whose ability to accomplish things together is much greater than what single individuals can accomplish alone. Alternatively, God is also a good candidate. Thus, the very important role that Pentecostalism, for example, plays among migrant players. Thus, forging relationships of interdependence with multiple others by sharing with them one's material resources, one's time, and one's labor is an excellent investment. Those who benefit from one's wealth at any given time will be obligated to reciprocate at a different moment when one finds oneself in need. This view contrasts fundamentally to the autonomy and freedom that have come to be so fundamental to a Western concept of what it means to be an individual, which is firmly grounded in ideas developed in the 18th century Enlightenment, and I viewed in many non-Western societies as completely dysfunctional. There, persons who count on nobody are likely to be considered witches. It is in this context that we need to understand athlete migrations from the global south to the global north. Athletic migrants are not autonomous individuals making rational decisions, but they are embedded in systems of social relations, particularly through kinship, which plays a central role in the migration of athletes. Kinship can come in many forms: the immediate family, the extended networks of relatives, spouses in either the country of origin or in the host country, or in many cases both, and so on. Together, they form often complex system of resource management and decision making. It is thus not surprising that in many cases, agents who promise sport contracts to young men are themselves relatives or are known to someone in the kinship network, and that relatives are often deeply involved in the decisions that one of theirs migrate. They supply the money, they provide emotional and other forms of support, and they also expect returns, upon a point to which I will come back presently. I'm not trying to underestimate the possibility, although real, that agents may not have the best interests of the migrant athletes at heart, and even that the families themselves may subordinate the welfare of their son to the illusions that his migration to France or Britain will somehow extricate them from conditions of material precarity. Indeed, foundations like Foot Solidaire, whose founder Jean-Claude Mbvoumin is here, are doing very important work rescuing young men stranded in the streets of France, French cities, after being promised the sky. However, our work demonstrates that simply focusing on the relationship between the migrant athlete and his agent does not engage with the complexity of most situations. Even though the role of agent does have a way of attracting unscrupulous individuals, automatically assuming that all go-betweens are motivated by dishonest design is disingenuous at best. The second aspect of sport migrations that I'm concerned with is athletes who is relevant to athletes who have managed to obtain some form of employment in sport. Generally speaking, the structure of rugby make it easier for players from the Pacific Islands to break into the sport with some success than for West Africans to make it as football professionals. One aspect of their lives that is of particular concern to many staff members of the clubs with which I had experience in various parts of the world, which employ them, is the pressure that many players are under to provide for their families back home. One Tongan rugby player I came to know well in Japan, for example, supports either fully or partially 70 relatives back in the island kingdom. These expectations place migrant athletes under considerable pressure to deliver. From the perspective of club staff members, most of whom operate with the capitalist logic of individual resource accumulation, family demands are a hindrance and a distraction on players' attention and on their personal welfare. In their view, players need to manage their resources and their income in a strategic way so that they and their spouses and children will be in a secure financial position, at least temporarily, by the time they leave the club. Of course, clubs are not terribly interested in what happens later. In Japan, global sport researcher Michael Peters has witnessed corporations who employ migrant Kenyan runners keep a significant part of the athlete's salary until the end of their contract. A measure that is designed to look after the athlete's welfare as well as protect the corporation from any liability that may arise from the debts and other financial problems that they suspect the athlete may incur. Even somewhat less paternalistically, in New Zealand and Australia, clubs and government agencies have invited private corporations like banks to give seminars to Pacific Island rugby players, advising them to open personal bank accounts to which relatives have no access and do not know about. Efforts that they are now exporting to the island countries. So, for example, to Fiji, where they are running seminars that have to cover issues such as health and well-being, remittances, financial literacy, and so on. Right. Sorry. Well, these efforts are motivated by well-meaning intentions again, as well, of course, as the banker's own intention, own interest in keeping relatively wealthy rugby players' money. They ignore the fact that Pacific Islander players are embedded in the structures of mutual dependence and long-term reciprocity that are fundamental to not only their society and culture, but also important to the athletes' welfare. When their performances decline, contracts evaporate, and incomes disappear. And they become, in turn, dependent on kinship networks to see them through old age and to nurse their broken bodies. To conclude, migrant athletes from the global south, I realize that this is a gross generalization, are more often than not embedded in structures of dependence and reciprocity, the extent and implication of which are very difficult for people in the global north to fully understand. This recognition provides a different perspectives on the problems of human trafficking and life management of athletes than that which they are commonly understood. It suggests that clubs and teams be more attentive to the relations of mutual dependence and hierarchy that players are involved in, and that they sometimes create and nurture among themselves in host countries. Pairs and threesomes and foursomes of siblings, for example, playing for the same team in Japan and in France. France has actually sets of 4 players in its rugby industry, all from the same family, obviously, who support one another and nurture each other, where older brothers look after younger brothers, and so on. Even when they're not related through kinship, they also create fictive relationship and take care of each other. And this is one thing that that teams are actually quite unaware of and should be banking on as a resource to alleviate some of what they construct as problems. It suggests that clubs and teams be more attentive to the relations of mutual dependence and hierarchy that players are involved in, and that I've already said this. I urge caution before one treats them as problems, and call for an alternative view of these dynamics as potential tools to improve careers and life trajectories. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niko, Besnier. And now I have a problem because I didn't have the chance to rehearse your name, but I think that I'm calling upon Jean-Claude Mbvoumin or something like that. Something like that. Representing Food Solidaire, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and please present yourself.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Jean-Claude Mbvoumin. It's not very, very easy because in Cameroon there is this name do not exist because it was a mistake of the civil services. So I'm very happy because nobody in Cameroon know where I'm coming from. I'm not south, north, west. I'm very happy with that. Thank you very much to host me. I want to thank Jens and all the organizers of this very important conference. Play the Game is the place to be. I'm very happy to be here. I'm lucky to be here. I'm here to talk about the trafficking of young players, the protection, as we say, the protection of young players since 2000 when I founded Food Solidaire. I was a Cameroonian player. I played in Cameroon for one of the best teams in that time, Canon de Yaoundé. And I came in France in 1994 after the FIFA Under-20 World Cup in Australia. So I was recruited by AS Beauvais, who was a second division team in France. And I came to Europe with a professional contract, a formal contract. So I was not trafficked. And how I met this problem. Food Solidaire is a very, very long story, very, very sad story. Sometimes we need to be strong to continue the battle. I founded Food Solidaire in 2000 because of this problem. My colleague talk about a very excellent presentation about the modality of the traffic, about who traffic and how, and the countries and the system, all this system of exploitation of young players. I think I cannot teach you anymore, because I think that was a very complete presentation. What I want to talk to you today is Foot Solidaire. We have a 15-year-old, but I can assure you that it's not very, very easy, because we faced at the beginning a kind of deny. Everybody said, Jean-Claude, this problem do not exist. With Agergaard, the former trainer of France, we tried to talk with everybody in France, the players' union, the clubs' union, the Ministry of Sport. Everybody said, no, this problem do not exist. It's a very marginal problem. It's just 1 or 2 or 3 young players. And somebody at the UEFA said, you know, Jean-Claude, this problem, the young Africans, they are very happy to be in Europe. Even they are trafficked, they are very happy to be here. And I was very, very, it was very, very strange. And if I'm here today is to talk about, to explain the difficulty of the problem. Last month in Brussels, I attended the meeting, the ICSS meeting, and I want to thank Emanuel Medeiros, who very early time in 2007, I talked with him and he said, this is a very good issue. We'll do something with you. We support you. And today, since that time, Emanuel is with Foot Solidaire. Because this fight was a personal fight. I was a young player in Cameroon, and I made this problem in France, and I said, how can I deny this problem? How can I be blind with this problem? I'm a former player. I have to do something. But nobody in France helped Foot Solidaire. It was very, very difficult. With our friends, with our members, we tried to talk with the football bodies. In 2008, we organized this meeting at the FIFA, but no result. They organized the World Cup in Africa, and this was a better time to go in Africa to talk with the people. But the FIFA say, no, we cannot help you. Why? We don't know. I tried to talk with the FIFPro. I'm very happy to meet one of the members here. This was with the FIFPro Afrique. I met Theo Van Segelen. I met everybody at FIFPro. I traveled maybe 50,000 miles for Foot Solidaire to FIFPro, the FIFA. Nobody moved. Nobody moved. And as we discussed at the ICSS Europe meeting in Brussels last month, it's time to do something. It's not a problem of Foot Solidaire. We was a kind of whistleblower, but today is not a problem. What we need is that this cause must go forward, with or without Foot Solidaire. But for me, I'm very proud today to see big institutions like ICSS with Emanuel, who did a very good job with the EPFL. He invited Foot Solidaire in several meetings when he was at Nyon. But I say today is the good moment, is the good time. You know, at the beginning of this project, I didn't understand or speak any kind of English. I didn't know, I didn't speak English, but I tried to learn English because of this cause of Foot Solidaire. But today I'm here to say we have to do something. When we are looking for the problem with the big institution in football, all the problem we face today with the football, you know what I mean, is because some people chose to say we are blind, we don't see anything, everything is all right. But the future of football is today is with the youngster, is with the young players in Africa, in Europe, in South America, in Latin America, and tomorrow in Asia, because today we have more and more cases coming from Asia. So I think I'm just here today to give you my testimony of this very, very difficult fight. And because we cannot continue to watch football on the TV while thousands of youngsters are on the street in Europe, while in Africa nothing is done in Africa. When we talked with the FIFA, we said you have to do something with the African FA, because You give money for the youth football, but any championship is organized, anything is done in Africa. You have academies, informal, non-official academy. How to organize this? All the FA in Africa said, that is not our problem. This is informal football. We just want to deal with the official football, all the academies registered in our organization. But we know that in Africa today we have about 70 to 80% of youth football, which is out of the football association. So it's important today. We hope the new FIFA, the next FIFA, will take this problem seriously. And the FIFPro also, I launched a call to the FIFPro today to know why Foot Solidaire, you don't want to help us. Why you don't want to deal with Foot Solidaire. We are not, you don't want somebody said, Jean-Claude, you are doing a revolution. I'm not a terrorist. We just try to say, help the children, do something for the youngster, African youngster, because we know that we are talking about Latin America, about Asia, but we know that in Africa there are a lot of, many problems because of economical, social problems, because of the business. In Africa, football is not a business, it's not to train, to educate. Any academy, I was in Senegal, I'm coming from Senegal yesterday morning. Any academy with which I'm speaking, they said, Jean-Claude, our main goal is to transfer people, the young player. We need money. But why do you can find another job if you need money? You know, training of young people is education, is health, gender equality, all these values we know. But in Africa today is a complete disaster, We have a few academy who try to do a good job, but many of them are today in a very, very bad way of merchandisation. To sell the young players is not about football, it's just money and money. So what I want to highlight here is also the competition on this issue, because when we talk about many organizations, I cannot give the name here. Everybody say, oh, you know, we are the leading organization in the protection of minors, so we don't need Foot Solidaire. Okay, so I think today we need to join our forces, because it will be late. Last night I said to Emanuel, I think I can stop Foot Solidaire, because I think nobody in Europe is democracy. Europe is a human right, children right. This is the continent of the human right. So if Foot Solidaire can't find a support, this is dramatic. So I think today I'm very happy because Emanuel yesterday said, Jean-Claude, we are supporting you. I am supporting you. I'm happy because I'm here. That is a good sign for Foot Solidaire that Play the Game is also here to give the voice to a small organization like Foot Solidaire. But I want to say we don't have to deal with, we don't have to make competition. I think with the FIFPro, for example, we need to work with FIFPro because we are educating the future professional who are not, for example, in Africa, there is a need of education, and try to explain what is professional football. And then when the young players become professional and the FIFPro can continue the job. So this is an appeal. In December, we are organizing a conference in Dakar, because I think when we are talking about problem, we have to give a solution, our solution in our point of view of practitioner. We think in Africa today we need information, and we have to responsibilize Africans, because when we are talking about Africa, they are not kids. Africa, they are responsible, and a lot of parents with which I talked last week, they said, okay, what can we do? We have our children, they want to make it professional player, but nobody help. The FA don't help. We don't have any information how to do. So we had, imagine this information center. We want to set up the first one in Senegal, because we need, first of all, information. We cannot be behind every family, every young player. What they need today is to know what is football, what is, and one of the drama of these last months is the step back of the FIFA on the regulation, when they remove the player's agent license, when they reduce the age limit of to deliver the international transfer certificate from 12-year to 10-year-old. I think this is very bad. This is step back on the way for the protection of a young player. I think we have to maybe we hope the new FIFA have to face the problem. They have to, but I think we hope in February next year, we hope the next FIFA president will take this problem seriously. So talking about this information center is very, very important. It's crucial to have the information center. It's important to have to give the best practice. I am member of the ICSS Europe Task Force for the protection of young players. I'm very proud of that because we have a partner, an organization with we can work, who can help, and together to be strong together, because I think is a common issue. Is like football. You have to play. The whole team have to play. Everybody in his own department, I can say. So we need your help, at the help of the FIFPro. I'm very happy to meet you here. The help of any organization that will be the first information center. We don't know if that will work. We don't know, but maybe we have to try and see how we have the support of the Senegalese FA. For the first time in Africa, we have the support of a FA. That was very challenging because everybody is afraid. Because for Solidaire, if we do some bad practice, they can see what we are doing. So the FA say, okay, we are happy to host you in Senegal. And we have also the support of the presidency of Senegal, the Minister of Sport and Youth. And we hope if you want to attend this conference in Dakar, 7 and 8 of December, you are welcome. And I would like to thank again Mrs. Moderator and all the participants and Play the Game for the opportunity given to Foot Solidaire to give this testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude. Very interesting. Now, I'm also challenged by my language skill, but I'm calling upon Emanuel Macedo de Medeiros. Almost. He's a CEO of ICSS Europe, and if you don't know what ICSS stands for, it's the International Center of Sports Security. Thank you very much.
Now that I've got your attention, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Allow me to start my intervention. I think I was given 20 minutes. I was expecting to be the normal 3 to 5, so you have to bear with me. I'm not here to announce any candidature to FIFA. I'm sorry if I have disappointed some of you, or to talk about FIFA. Although what I have to say, in a way, has to do with FIFA. Because what I'm here to talk about is also about lack of leadership, lack of courage to do what's right. I would like to thank Jens and the Play the Game team for organizing this excellent conference, for bringing to light serious problems, controversial issues, for giving the floor to people who is not afraid of speaking up their minds, people like me who do not dig trenches to hide what we think, no matter what the consequences may be. I would like to thank also Play the Game for putting this topic on the agenda. And looking for the number of people in the room, one could be even tempted to say, well, that this is not, the most interesting or pressing or urgent or vital topic. We have heard during the last few days so many vibrant, hot discussions about FIFA, about the future of the world's governing body, integrity, credibility, values, probity, were words that were echoed in these and other rooms full of people. And yet, today, we are less. Perhaps this fever, this voracious flame that consumes all the attention, leaves no space for other topics, leaves no room to address other concerns. And if that is the case, then I think it is not a good thing. Because these topics deserve to come from the shadows to the light. These topics are serious. These concerns are real. And the need for solutions, also in these topics, are not mere conveniences. They are necessities. So thank you, Play the Game. Thank you, Jens. And thank you, all of you, for being here. Because your presence here is also a statement that this matter matters, a statement that our voice must be heard, a statement that solutions are needed, a statement that we must cooperate, because united we will not only play the game, we will win the game. So, apologies also to Play the Game as well, because my intervention has no title. I thought about that, and I thought about what would I say. But I could not find a better title than the one that was chosen. Transfers and Traffickers, the Human Cost of Broken Dreams. It says it all. It touches the sensitive nerves. It has the dramatic component that this matter, unfortunately, carries not only to the victims and their families, but also to all those who care about sport, who care about the sport's role in our society, as a school of values, as a role model, as a catalyst for social and human development. So I'm here to talk about precisely this. And I have structured my intervention in five parts. Firstly, I would like to set the scene and outline what, in my view, is the mother of all evils that confront not just our society, but our sport. Secondly, I will talk about transfers, and my friends from FIFPro can rest assured that this is not going back to the old days when we were in a healthy dialectic and discussion about the merits or the merits of the current transfer system. But I would like to say a few things about transfers. I will say also what I think about agents and the outcome of the recent FIFA reform on agents. I will speak about youth development, trafficking of players, and I will try to outline in a few words what can be the game plan for the future. But right now, ladies and gentlemen, if I can master this fantastic piece of technology, I would like to introduce you to the worship of Menon. I think this is, it's this one, sorry. The worship of Menon. This is a 1909 painting by an English painter called Evelyn de Morgan. And I think it captures quite eloquently what I would like to say at the outset. If you see carefully, you will see a number of strong elements in this painting. You will see a woman, you will see a bag of gold, and you will see a statue, Mammon. Now, in the painting, the woman clutches desperately at the knee of the statue, yamming up into his face, which stares down at her remorselessly. The statue holds, as I said, a bag of gold, but the woman ignores the money. She is turned to the statue. She has moved her love from her love of gold to the love of Mammon itself. And so she has cut herself from the love of God, thus causing her doom. This is what this painting symbolizes. A painting that was inspired in the New Testament in a verse that you all know about the impossibility to love two masters, to love God and to love Mammon at the same time. Now, Mammon is a word whose origin comes from the Syrian, and translated into English, it means greed. Greed. Now, greed for some is good. You all remember the 1987 film with Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen, where Gordon Gekko makes this eloquent speech in a shareholders meeting, explaining them why they should dismantle this company, throw into unemployment thousands and thousands of work, because the vile metal, money, greed, was more important than anything else. Now, we have also seen throughout this conference a lot about greed. It is, in a way, greed that led the world of sport to the chaos, to the swamp, to the darkness that some have highlighted here throughout the last few days. Greed. And that is unacceptable. We have heard a lot about problems over the last few days, but I think it's also time to talk about what is positive, to talk about sport's role in our society, to talk about people's passion, to talk about how sport can inspire new generations. And we all have in our minds Mandela's speech about the power of sport. So sport has the power to change the world, and sport has changed my world, has changed my life, as it has changed yours. So we need also to emphasize the positive aspects of sport. But, obviously, the brightest lights also cast the darkest shadows. And as more money is put into sport, so are the threats and the dangers. In terms of transfers, look to how sophisticated, how complex, how globalized has become the market. Look how new threats, new trends have emerged, threatening sports' long-term interests and future. New phenomena like third-party ownership of race economic rights. Something that FIFA has proclaimed to be banned, but something which is exactly done the same way as before under a new name. And if the gentlemen in Zurich or in Lyon were not attentive to what I warned them, I think reality has shown that there was a migration of practice, of investments from players' economic rights to club ownership. And everything is done without robust regulation, without robust oversight, which means that we have more and more complex problems to handle. We also have the pernicious action of offshore financial vehicles. We have offshore investment funds whose ownership, whose structure is completely opaque. Now, I know that the gentlemen of the press nowadays are busy with the FIFA issue. But perhaps someday they would like also to give some attention to what is happening in the real world. I have seen the Spanish press saying about issues that confronted some of the world's best football players. Devastating incidents related to money laundering and tax evasion. They were a footnote, because nowadays what matters is FIFA. So these issues cannot be omitted. And the seriousness and the damage, not just in sport but in society, cannot be ignored. The same could be said in relation to the agents. Back in 2009, and I think my friends from FIFPro will remember this, there was apparently a very strong consensus that the FIFA regulations on agents should be simply trashed, flushed away from the map, because what matters was to have a free-for-all, and all those who wanted to be active in the transfer market, regardless of their credentials, regardless of their moral capacity or their professional aptitude, what mattered was to have this free avenue so that everybody could be pleased and have the players they wanted. I and the organization I served back then was probably one of the few, if not the only voice, opposing to that free-for-all derogatory approach. And from 2009 to 2012, we worked also to deliver alternative solutions. And I voiced on behalf of all European leagues a solution, a compromise, which would involve a registration system, but not a cosmetic registration system as we have. A registration system with qualitative criteria, so that those who could not have the credentials, those unscrupulous individuals, could not have a field of play and could not have action in the transfer market. Not only that, I suggested that only registered individuals could be receiving financial compensation from clubs or players. More, these payments must be done, I said then, through a clearinghouse, so that we know who is paying how much to whom, encouraging greater transparency, greater financial integrity. But unfortunately, these proposals were not adopted. And I think this explains why we have so much money in the game, which is good. We welcome investment in sport, but not every investment. Transparency is not negotiable. Financial integrity is non-negotiable. And that is why we need, among other measures, an international clearinghouse so that we know who is paying how much to whom. As we need proper oversight, due diligence, regulation in terms of club ownership. And those who are familiar with that know that I have reasons to be concerned about what is happening. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot to be done. And this brings me to the last part of my intervention. Trafficking of minors and broken dreams. And about broken dreams, let me share with you 3 simple but real stories, which I shared a while ago in a conference we organized in Brussels in partnership with the European Commission. These are the stories about 3 boys, Effa, Morris, and Ellie. Effa Steve. Effa was a typical boy from Equatorial Guinea. Every day, Effa used to go to the local football field, laden with trash and broken shards of glass, to play football with his friends. He was 14. He was approached by a Bulgarian man who offered to escort him to Europe and let him try out for one of the top football clubs for a small price. Names like Drogba, Essien, and others flashed through the boy's mind. After all, these African players had succeeded So why couldn't he? 2 years later, and little progress, Affe found himself living in a poor house in Paris, and the agent was nowhere to be found. This is the story of Affe Steve. Maurice Kohn. Maurice was trafficked from his home in South Africa in 2010. Maurice and his parents struggled to meet the demands of the agent until Maurice's father went into debt to see his son to the West in the hopes that in the future he could take charge of his 7 brothers and sisters. Regrettably, Maurice's story didn't have an happy ending too. Finally, Ali. It was in June 2011 that Ali arrived at Mississippi, full of dreams, that is normal of a boy of his age. Dreams of being groomed for collegiate basketball scholarships. And he arrived, obviously with a smile in his face, excited by his agent's promises. It was America, so what could go wrong? As it turned out, a lot did go wrong. A few months later, Ali was sleeping in the floor of a living room with one pillow shared by him and 2 other Nigerian teenagers. Ali is now 21. He works as a security guard in Queens. He no longer harbors the dreams of having his education underwritten by a basketball scholarship. I still love the game, he said some time ago to a reporter, but it's a dirty business, and I don't want to get involved again. So stories like this, ladies and gentlemen, they are unfortunately mounting. They spare no sport, they spare no country. The problems do not concern football alone, or underdeveloped countries, as some say. They affect all sports, they affect all countries, they affect all continents. Some of us have probably heard stories about the basketball factories in Latin America. You have also heard, probably, that the US Department of Homeland Security, about 6 or 7 months ago, raided a place where inside the school's gym they found 30 boys, mostly from Dominican Republic, sleeping on the floor. But the rest of the story is quite common, so you easily imagine what were the conditions that these boys were living. In some ways it was not too different from what authorities have seen in Laos, in Champasak United Football Club, when 23 underage boys were found living in subhuman conditions. But I think also it's fair to say that not only the authorities are attentive to this, but they are working to prevent, to change mentalities, and to educate against these problems. And that is why the US Homeland Security is developing a very, very interesting and fruitful campaign called the Blue Campaign to prevent and combat child trafficking and human trafficking. So, ladies and gentlemen, stories of broken dreams, stories that happen too often, stories of desperation and poverty, stories of deception, unscrupulous individuals, and crime, stories of modern-day slavery, which is a paradox in the second decade of the 21st century. Stories that victimize sport and cover our society in shame. According to the United Nations, trafficking of human beings is the 3rd largest criminal enterprise in the world. However, trafficking of young athletes is still somehow, as Jean-Claude said, a cursed word, a forbidden topic, a taboo. And given my background, I think I can evaluate how unpopular this subject can be. But Jean-Claude and others are doing what they can to change the circumstances. And to change the circumstances, we need to understand a few basic facts. First, young players, young athletes are not commodities. They are human beings and must be treated as such. Second, the abuse of young athletes in the name of sport is relatively widespread, even in the so-called civilized societies. It includes imposition of training regimes suited for adult athletes, encouraging the development of eating disorders, doping, psychological, physical and emotional abuse from parents and coaches, and sometimes even sexual abuse. It culminates in trafficking and sale of young athletes and the violation of a number of other fundamental principles. Third, pressure to perform is exerted by parents, clubs, and coaches. A lot could be said about this. Fourth, playing with the false hopes of millions of impoverished slum mothers, conned into believing that their footballing sons will rescue them from misery. Trafficking of young players is a business, and is a business that has gained deep roots, facilitated by a permissive environment and a widespread feeling of impunity. But more than a business, what trafficking of players, young players, is actually is a crime, and it must be punished as such. Now, the problems are there. The diagnosis is easy to make. But what must unite us, what must mobilize our energies, our willingness, our strengths, is to work together, to set up a game plan for the future. And this is precisely the spirit that led us to invite other leading international organizations into a joint, united, concerted, global effort to enhance standards in terms of recruitment, training, education of players. Organizations like Solidaire, like the European Commission, like the Council of Europe, UNESCO, the Commonwealth, the Ibero-American community, the community of Portuguese language countries, UNICEF, and many others who are working with us in a spirit of constructive cooperation, in a framework of recognition and mutual respect to tackle what is today one of the most devastating problems that our sport is faced. We do it with a genuine belief that this is the right way forward. And fortunately, we know that we can count on you to help us drive this project forward, and we will do the utmost also to meet your expectations. Thank you very much for your attention, for your patience, and also for your encouragement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and don't worry about the coffee break. You'll have your coffee break, and you'll have as long as you should have had. But before then, I'll invite the legal director of FIFPro, and he's going to talk about why the transfer system should be abolished. So we look forward to his speech.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. A few months ago, when I was asked to make a presentation for this conference, I was asked to talk on child trafficking in football. But recent developments changed the subject, so the subject is why the transfer system should be abolished. I will also reflect on child trafficking, but it will not be as extensive as I intended. First of all, the transfer system. What was the transfer system? It was a kind of system where you, when you signed for a club, you couldn't move to another club without the permission of your team, of your employer. And it was even after your contract had expired. Looking at this now, you say, well, this is a ridiculous and unacceptable concept, but it existed for quite a long time. The consequences were that players, were stuck to their club, and only when the club saw some benefit in selling you, then you could move to another club. And the system came into existence quite short after professional football was introduced in England 100 years ago. But from the start, it was criticized as a system and saying, well, this is not acceptable, it's trading of human beings. But the first concrete steps against the system only occurred in the beginning of the 60s, when Jimmy Hill, at the time the president of the Players Association in England, the PFA, started to organize players against the transfer system. And the one who responded best to all of this was George Eastham, and he had his court case in 1964. And the outcome was that for England, just for England, we had the end of the retainer system. So there was a kind of freedom for players in England. Here is the man, and he deserves all the credit we can give him. In the meantime, we had the development of the European Union. It was an economic cooperation which guaranteed the freedom of trade, services and labor, and including a legal framework to secure those freedoms. But looking at sports and at the European Union, we see, and it was discussed in other presentations these days, sports autonomy. We look at one side the European community and the other side the sports autonomy, two separate worlds. But the big change came in 1974 when we had the pacemaker in cycling, Bruno Walraven, who challenged a rule in cycling where he was not able to, as a Dutch citizen, he was not able to work with Belgian riders. And he brought his case before the European Court, and the European Court said, well, European law applies if there's an economic activity involved. And so from then on, we knew that professional sports was subject to EU law. But of course, the big breakthrough we got in 1995, exactly 20 years ago, when we had the Bosman ruling. Bosman was challenging the system. He said, well, I want to exercise my freedom of movement, and I'm blocked by the transfer system. And from the Bosman ruling, and I summarize it very, very fast, we know that professional athletes are workers and that they can exercise workers' rights. And the conclusion was, as we thought, the end of the transfer system. But in fact, we were dealing with rules within UEFA, rules within FIFA, and well, the old system could not be maintained. And the question then was, who needs to act? In fact, we were talking, like Bosman, for the European territory, but also FIFA was involved in the transfer system, so there was kind of a collision between UEFA and FIFA, and eventually FIFA took the lead in this discussion, and they closed in 2001 an informal agreement with the European Commission. It is important to see that at the time when you have a regulation with the Commission, it's obvious that you need to be compliant with EU law principles. So this meant that the new FIFA rules were compliant with EU law. But on the other hand, FIFA was able to agree on specificities of sport. They were able to convince the Commission that football is special and needs special rules. So we saw protected periods, transfer windows, prohibition to negotiate new contracts during your contract, etc. And then the role of FIFPro. Well, to be honest, we were just able to jump on the bandwagon and play a very small role in these negotiations. But looking at the regulations on the status of transfer and for players, the application, well, as FIFA took the lead in this, we saw the application on a global level and in any federation around the world, so even outside of the EU. And the proof of this, you see them here, are the Bueno Rodriguez case, Uruguayan players moving to France. They were under Uruguayan law system, but in the end it proved that also the EU law principles applied to them even when they were coming from South America. But looking at the new rules in the 2001 agreement and EU law principles, we saw a big difference between the theory and the practice. In theory, you could say, well, the new FIFA rules are compliant with EU law, but the practice is quite different. We saw that big problems occurred in football, overdue payables. I refer you to the FIFPro Black Book we made in 2012, showing that thousands of players were not paid in Eastern European territory. The lack of labor protection. Many players do not have labor contracts. They are self-employed, they have service contracts, and even in some countries there are mentioned trash contracts, giving them big problems and no protection of the labor law. Looking at the trafficking of minors, also something which is one of the big problems in football, the third-party ownership, as explained by Emanuel. We have match fixing and the role of intermediaries and, as they previously were called, agents. Looking at the minors, we are not talking only about kids coming from Africa or maybe from Asia. We also have the problem in Western Europe. We saw disciplinary cases against Chelsea, against Barcelona. And of course, there are measures against trafficking of children. The player passport. From 12 and up, you need, when you transfer, a player passport. Is that enough? No, it's not, because we saw that clubs were turning to players from younger than 12 years. So we succeeded in having the age reduced to 10. We should have it to 0, but in fact, our initiative worked for a bit. There is a special transfer matching system monitoring the movement of minors. And there is a prohibition in the rules for international transfers for under 18s. But there are exceptions and they are abused. When we look at the exceptions for minors, we see that children living in border areas, they can move from one country to another. The other one is when the parents move for reasons not related to football. How does it work in practice? Clubs offer parents jobs in public transport in England, and then they say, well, you have a very talented son, can we sign him? That's how it is circumvented. And also there's a special rule for the EU that the limitation is to under 16. And what's happening in practice, we only saw at the highest level of procedures with the Court of Arbitration, only one case where this was a real subject, the Acuña Caballero case, where a player coming from Paraguay to Spain, and then they offered his mother a job as a cook in a restaurant, and they said, well, you have a very talented son, and we sign him. This was not accepted, but on the other hand, there are hardly any disciplinary cases regarding this issue. There are also other measures against the transfer or trafficking of minors. When you are an intermediary, an agent, you cannot charge any fee. Also, this mechanism is circumvented. It's not enforced. And we see in a recent case that in the Czech Republic we saw an agent advertising a 10-year-old boy on his website. Nothing happened against this, even when we alarmed the federation there. There's also the third-party ownership where alternative money flows occur. The agents have discovered this and they are trying to get extra money besides their fees from the future transfers of players. So in fact, when we look at all those measures, we can think they're not working and maybe the impact is misconcepted. And then the argument, which we hear from clubs, are kids better off when they move? That's the Barcelona argument. They, 2 years ago, they sent a letter to FIFA saying, well, we know about the rules, about the prohibition on minors, but we are such a good academy, we can give the children a better future, and we want to have a kind of exemption from these rules. Well, this urged FIFA to take action against Barcelona. They got a ban. And there it was obvious that, well, in fact, the rules should be maintained. You can say, well, maybe some kids are better off when they go to Barcelona at a young age. But what about the other clubs? If you accept Barcelona, you cannot refuse other clubs. This means you get more problems. We also saw what can happen if minors move. Emanuel, you mentioned the case. Minor players moving from Liberia to Laos and left on their own in very bad circumstances. The BBC had a documentary on this. But also outside football, how does the normal world respond? The problem is not taken seriously. Last year I went to the National Bureau in Holland for child trafficking, and I explained the problems we also have in Holland from children moving to England and to other countries. Well, they said, well, this is strictly a parent thing and we don't want to interfere. So there you can see it's not taken seriously. But within football, we have to realize FIFA is a monopoly. It's a single market model. And when you have a toolbox, you can also enforce it. And when you enforce it, you can be an example for the rest of the world and other branches where Professor Besnier was talking about. Not only we are talking about sports, but also child trafficking in other industries. We can set an example. This should be realized by FIFA. Back to the transfer system, where we see that dispute resolution is a big problem. I cannot, because of the time, I cannot elaborate on this. But looking at those mechanisms, we see that we have, within FIFA, we have a dispute resolution system. We have it on national levels, but also on CAS. And there we see that the EU law matters are really a problem for players' rights to be enforced. And in fact, we can say too much problems are caused by the system. We say that it's protective for clubs, it's abusive for players. And also we have to realize that the transfer system is only in football. No other sports have a transfer system. And are there mechanisms to cope with these problems? Well, we tried as FIFPro. We tried to participate in UEFA and FIFA bodies, not at the highest level, but in the strategic committees of both bodies. And also we started at our initiative a social dialogue with the European Club Association and the EPFL. In 2012 we had an agreement on the minimum requirements of football, which is kind of a European collective bargaining agreement, but still it was a very minimal level. And we saw it as a start, sorry, but the other ones saw it as an end, we thought. And now we are stuck in the process of the implementation of our minimum requirements, and still we see problems. In 12 countries in Europe, there are no labor contracts for players. We see the system of repetition of protected period, meaning that players cannot leave their club. If you refuse to sign a new contract, it means that you are sidelined or being put on the bench. We also see overdue payables as a big problem. There now is a 3-month rule within FIFA and saying if you're not paid for 3 months, you can terminate your contract with just cause. There are clubs that in fact abuse this regulation and don't pay their players until they're almost at the end of the 3 months period. Then they say, well, now here's your money, so you can't leave. We want to have a 30-day rule, which is not accepted by our partners. And also, the new rules on intermediaries can be a problem. We are now looking at the 14-year struggle with no cooperation, with no progress. And that was a reason for us to have a FIFPro expert working group where we identified 22 reasons why the transfer system fails on players. And our conclusion was, we can do without the transfer system. On the other hand, we had our ECA partner, social partner. They had also a report and say, well, the system works. We have a trickling down effect. The money coming from transfers is going down to the clubs in the lower divisions. CISS research shows us that 80% of the money sticks with the leagues in the highest ranges and the richer clubs. So we thought how to achieve our goal. We can go to court. Problem is, we don't want to sacrifice players. If you have a football player going to court, it's the end of his career. Then we decided to go to the European Commission with our complaint. There are 3 departments: employment, sports and competition, and 3 levels we could, in a legal way, we can deal with: free movement, freedom of trade, and human rights. We chose to go for competition law. It's the strongest department. You have a direct approach to private enterprises like FIFA. And I start my own Q&A here. Can football survive without a transfer system? And we think it can. Look at the other sports and look where football is going now. The richer clubs get richer. We need a competitive sport, respect of players' rights, and players are human beings and not assets. We heard this before. The debate will continue in our respect on our legal conference on 14 and 15 December. I put some flyers on the table. If you're interested, you're welcome. But looking at the question of your conference, Global Sport, Reform or Revolution, it's certainly revolution. Thank you.
So, we've had 4 very interesting presentations this morning. Now it's time for coffee. But do come back. We have another very interesting presentation and a lot of interesting questions to discuss. We'll meet again before 10:15. So we are starting at 11:15, sorry. 11:15, we'll start again. Enjoy coffee.
Slukket. Der er optaget 3 for dem. Hvor lang tid vi har været i gang i? En time og 3. Ikke, vi må bare starte, når vi starter igen.
Der er ikke noget at gøre ved det. Vi tænder den bare, og vi starter igen.
So, welcome back. We
is not on the table. What we do, however, in our daily work is, I would sum it up by saying we try to promote and protect sport. What protect means look at all the questions of integrity. Generally, that's related to the top of the pyramid, sports pyramid, football especially. There's a lot to say there. Things like working on doping, match fixing, good governance in general, violence and intolerance, these sort of things. So trying to tackle the threats to sport, to protect the game, and then promote the value of sport for society. I think one of the speakers earlier, it might have been Emanuel, made the reference to the fact that sports has so much to give to society and can actually act as a stimulus for social change. That's something that we work on a lot, and we try to promote sport, for example, for health-enhancing physical activity, for social inclusion, and for through things like dual careers. Case in point, social inclusion here. I'll come to that in a moment. Going back to the protect side, so I think agents is a very big part of this discussion. We talked about intermediaries earlier on, and we were also involved since 2009 in this discussion. We had a very extensive study which showed the extent of the problems deriving from the way the agents are regulated. We had a very interesting conference. FIFPro was also there, the ECA, EPFL, everybody from the world of football, FIFA as well. And we discussed various options, also involving EU policy, standard setting, for example, like ISO. There's a precedent in the field of real estate, which we examined, and we had a presentation. We talked about these. It was decided at the time to let FIFA, in a sort of self-regulation, shall we say, approach, deal with the problem, because they were also moving ahead. It took a while, but since April 2015, so April this year, they've changed the rules on intermediaries. It's a sort of system of devolution, shall we say, whereby national associations now deal with licensing the agents, or registering, should I say correctly, the agents. Emanuel is very clear that he doesn't think the approach is the best one. On our side, we're giving it a little bit of time to see how it works. And if it doesn't work, of course, we will revisit it. Now, what can we do about it? Well, in our initial study, there was no basis for an internal market intervention, since there wasn't any proof of fragmentation of the internal market. When, however, now all the different member states are introducing their own approaches, different sometimes approaches, on a basis of minimum harmonization, but some are going much further than others, perhaps there will be a basis for internal market intervention. But all of this is to be seen. I think time will tell a little bit on the agent side. We also looked at transfers, the transfer system, the legal economic aspects of transfer system. On that note, the reflection was cut short by FIFPro's complaint submitted to the European Commission, to the competition authorities. I think it was last month, earlier. Yeah, and obviously, I would agree that the transfer system has numerous problems. This is one way of dealing with it, and currently the competition authorities are investigating. So I would refrain from commenting further on the transfer system. There's another aspect, though, which plays into this whole discussion about trafficking in minors, which I don't think anybody's touched upon yet, and that's homegrown players. European football is characterized by the homegrown players rule, which places a lot of value on young players. If a player has spent 3 seasons between the ages of 15 and 21 in a given association, then he's considered homegrown. Just a theoretical question out there: has this perhaps put more pressure on transfers on younger players in order to get them in within that window or before that window? I think this is a question that came up a little bit in one of our studies, and I just want to put it out there since we've covered a number of different aspects. I think this is also something that should be considered in this bigger picture of the problem of trafficking in minors. Of course, from a legal perspective and outside the field of sport, the EU does a lot. There's directives on the protection of minors at the workplace. There's directives on trafficking in human beings, and of course there's a Council of Europe Convention as well in this field. But dealing with 28 different member states in the field of things like criminal law is not easy. For that reason, there's an EU coordinator on trafficking in human beings, and her work is challenging, to say the least. That, of course, is the broader picture, not just sport. So I just wanted to underline that there are certain tools out there. It's a question of implementing them correctly and at the national level. Moving on, another element which we try to bring to the table is expert groups. Since we don't have legislative power in the field of sport, what we do is we bring together experts from all the member states and also observer organizations. Actually, there's a few of you here I've seen at this conference who participate in our expert groups. The idea is to draw up recommendations addressed at both member states, local authorities, European authorities, but also sports organizations. So one of the expert groups works on good governance, and that expert group is going to look, starting I think in January, at recommendations on protecting young athletes and safeguarding the rights of children in sport, which I think is very interesting. The discussion has not yet been launched, so I'm looking forward to taking away from this debate here today elements which we can feed into that process. And I would encourage anybody who feels very strongly about one or another point to come see me afterwards, for example, and we can hopefully channel that into the discussion. Recommendations themselves, of course, I think we have to be realistic. They're not the be-all and end-all. They won't solve problems. But what they can do, if they're properly monitored, and if you have reporting exercises afterwards, they can create very fertile ground for achieving change. Then, on the promoting side, I mentioned social inclusion, and that's a point I want to elaborate on a little bit. I think I'd be preaching to the converted here if I went on too long about the social benefits of sport in terms of social inclusion, the ability to integrate, for example, people like migrants through sport, and the situation which Jean-Claude described before of abandoned youth, especially in the Mediterranean areas, who are facing broken dreams and then have few options, find it difficult to integrate. There, sports can play a key role. So what are we doing? Well, in 2010, we funded 5 projects in the field of social inclusion. 3 of them dealt with migrants, another one dealt with prisoners, for example, reintegrating prisoners into society. The idea of our projects is that you should have 5 organizations from different member states. A reminder, we're the European Commission. We will never be funding a project like this in one or another member state. That's for the national authorities to look at. We look at cross-border collaboration, right? So actors from 5 different member states working together in order to share best practice, in order to develop, for example, toolkits, in order to set up networks in the field of social inclusion. And we've had some very good projects and very good results. So we're continuing to fund these kind of things. Now, through Erasmus+, which for the first time has a proper budget line for sports, 265 million euros for the 7-year period, 2014-2020. Last year we had 23 million dedicated to sports. In 2016 we will have 33 million dedicated to sports. 25%, not of 33, of a smaller number, 25% will be dedicated to social inclusion projects. I think it's a clear message that we're really putting the emphasis on this field. This is also, I think, a result of the broader political picture that we're all witnessing in the EU. So the project, I think, is a great way for organizations to become involved and for us to have some real success stories. Of course, the key afterwards is what do you do with these projects? Great project, we funded it, it goes into a drawer. No, the key is what to do with it afterwards. First of all, the project has to have certain continuity. If you develop a toolkit, then it has to be used. It has to be diffused to the end users. And that's a challenge for us. That's always a challenge for the EU to make sure that projects have a lifeline that goes beyond the 2-3 years of the actual intense sort of activity part. Communicating on these projects is very important, and putting them to good use and really sharing then the best practice is very important. But I'm very confident that in the field of sport, through our expert groups, for example, a lot of this is actually happening. Some member states are much more developed in this field than others, and we're using things like these projects, for example, in the field of dual careers. We developed guidelines for dual careers, for setting up frameworks on dual careers in each and all of the member states. And for some member states, this is very useful to help them develop this idea further. Others have it very well developed, but for many, it's a very useful addition. The point on, just to close on point on reflection. I don't want to sound naive when I talk about social inclusion through sport. There's a very interesting article in Figaro, I think, or Le Monde last week, where they described football clubs as breeding ground for fundamentalism and extremism. For sure, the same dynamics around a football club that allow somebody to integrate and feel part of a community are the same dynamics that build team spirit, that build this sort of community. And it's a very powerful force, and we have to also be very careful that it can be used for the wrong ends, not only the right ends. I just wanted to mention that because it's something that came across my desk when we were talking about this last week. And I think it's important to keep this in mind when we talk about social inclusion, in that we shouldn't be naive about this. And we have to be very careful. So, in a nutshell, there's a number of different things that the EU can do in terms of sharing best practice in order to create an environment which will be safer for migrants who make it to the EU or are facing difficulties. There's also a number of things we can do to protect the game and to improve its integrity. There, of course, we fall back on much broader questions of good governance, and we've heard a lot about good governance or the lack thereof in professional football yesterday at the conference, for example. They're both these sort of two fields of protecting and promoting, two fields that we continue to work on. And what's key for us is to be in touch not only with the authorities of the member states, but more importantly, perhaps with sports stakeholders. And we need as much input from sports stakeholders as possible in order to make all of this exchanging good practice an exercise which goes way beyond just putting some ideas on paper and actually has an impact on the ground. Thank you very much.
So now it's time for you to put questions to the panel, and there will be some walking around with microphones. Please stand up when you ask your question. Any questions? If not, I have plenty of questions, but anyone want to give it a... Then I will start. So we have had 5 very interesting presentations, and we are all talking towards the theme of human trafficking. But as we have talked about, it's a field both in the public debate and also as a research field that's very little developed. There's very little investigation. And therefore, I would like to ask you the basic question, first of all. To what extent should we think of transfers in not only football but other kinds of sport as human trafficking? So I would like the panel to reflect on that. Niko already mentioned the dimension of people moving voluntarily, but also being linked up with agents and with money that may not, so they may not be aware of the dimensions of the industry that they go into. So, to what extent is transfer in sport human trafficking? Do you want to start, Niko?
I think...
Or Emanuel?
Yeah. Thank you for breaking the ice. and giving me the opportunity to set something straight. Transfers are not equal to human trafficking. Most of the transfers, most of the national, international movement of players is done in open light, in the face of millions and billions of people, in accordance with laws and regulations. And the players and club representatives and other intermediaries that are involved, they are not forced. The same as any one of us who signs a service agreement or an employment contract with a company, we're not being forced. So to use the word trafficking, I think it's not just extremely heavy, I think it's improper. And I would like to emphasize this because sometimes there is a perception that sport is a world of darkness, that sports organizations are like these subversive entities who live beyond the law, above the law, and outside the law. That is not true. And I also have some difficulties in listening to people who, when they speak about sport, they only speak about problems. They only speak about the issues, the threats. Let's also be constructive. Let's look to the other side of sport, which fortunately is the most important one. But like any organization, like any dynamic sector, like any family, sport and sports bodies are confronted with crossroads. They face problems. And some of these problems are the ones that we have addressed in this panel. And I think we are all united. United to preserve the respect for the law, respect for human rights, respect of the rights of the children, which are much more than just a philosophical proclamation, much more than just a romantic idea that inspires our civilization. It is also a commitment and a daily responsibility.
But to what extent is the right of the children being affected when loads of young people and children strive to become part of a dubious sporting industry without knowing?
But why do you say it's dubious? Why do you say it's dubious? Why do I sense at the outset that sport should be subject to an anathema? If we were talking about the banking industry, would we be saying the dubious banking industry? Oh. Yes,
the wrong example.
But maybe
interaction.
what do FIFPro think about?
Well,
is the transfer system human trafficking?
Well, it's growing close to it, I believe. And force as a criterion, I think, is not the right criterion. Because when you ask young children, do you want to play for Barcelona? They were very willing to go. But on the other hand, we have the human rights aspects, the protection of the minor, which made the rules that there's a prohibition on transfer of minors. So, and also, well, looking at force, the new phenomenon in football in transfers is the third-party ownership. There is force. As a player, you cannot refuse a transfer because otherwise your club, which you're playing for, will be sanctioned. So the pressure will be immense to move to another club. So it is close to human trafficking.
I totally disagree. I'm sorry. I have to be clear. I agree with my friend in many things. But to say that the transfer of a player is close to human trafficking is something that I cannot stand still and silent. I'm sorry to say it is not. No player is forced. We can discuss the rules under which a transfer occurs and the rights and obligations of both parties. We can discuss whether the relation between a club and an athlete is the same as a company and an employee in a factory. We can discuss that. But to say it's close to human trafficking, I think it is more than heavy.
Niko has a comment.
Yeah, two comments actually, two questions. I mean, as a good anthropologist, I always, my role is to make things more complex and unfortunately not provide many answers. But the two questions, one is that I think we need to ask ourselves, I certainly ask myself as a researcher, where does the notion of trafficking emerge and at what time? It is very much a product of the 1990s. And I think, and yet, in the 1990s were not necessarily a point in history at which anything terribly different began to happen. Perhaps there was a bit more movement of athletes, but I mean, there's no clean break. And yet, in the world at large, and yet this notion of human trafficking emerges, and it doesn't emerge in sport. It emerges mostly in fields like the sex industry, about which there has been a great deal more investigation, and I think we would actually quite benefit from understanding what has been talked about in such areas. And it emerges in a particular anxiety on the world scene about people moving, which we are experiencing right now with the refugee crisis in Europe. So I think we need to really understand how this notion of human trafficking actually emerges in the course of recent history. The other thing I wanted to throw into the discussion is this notion of minor. How does one define a minor, particularly in a international in a context in which people's age is actually an empirical question? I mean, Mark and Uroš, my two young colleagues, both document in ways that they can't really sort of be terribly specific about because there are legal implications and implications of ethics, but document the fact that many of the people whom they spent a great deal of time during the year of field work, their age is really something that is quite malleable in the context in which civil registration is not enforced as diligently as it is in Europe and the rest of the industrial world, and in which buying a birth certificate is actually something that people do as a matter of fact. So I think this notion of minor versus non-minor should be not just assumed to be straightforward and without problems, and should be really sort of an issue that we need to talk about in a larger context.
Great. I think there's a question. At least there is a question.
Sure. Hi, Andy Brown from the Sports Integrity Initiative. It's more of a comment, really. I feel we're only sort of scratching the surface here. I've heard sort of evidence of Wikipedia entries being falsified so players can be traded to various countries into Asia. You know, it's no doubt that the system facilitates this. And I suppose there is a question at the end of this, is what are you guys going to do to change the system?
That was a direct question to the panel.
Thanks.
Do you want to start, Sine?
I can.
Well, I think there's a, is this working? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I think there's a very clear next step in terms of what's going to happen to the system. FIFPro has submitted a complaint to the competition authorities of the EU. The investigation is going to take a while. It's going to be exhaustive. But it's usually heavy-handed in its decisions. So one way or another, there will be some sort of ruling on this. That's a very clear next step in terms of what are you going to do about it. I think that's the next thing that's going to happen. One way or another. I'm not saying that it's going to move in the direction that FIFPro hopes or that the ECA hopes, for that matter. We'll see.
Emanuel?
Well, we took the initiative to file the complaint in order to change the system. It's not in our hands. We are not a governmental body in football, but the Commission can do something, and also UEFA and FIFA can do something. If it's effective, it has to be awaited. But now we are on. We made a step, and things should happen now.
Thank you. My understanding is that your question was not directed about the complaint lodged by FIFPro and what the Commission is responding. Because I think this is a footnote, to be honest.
Clarify just There's all sorts of things going on here, not least of which is money laundering. People are using bridge clubs to artificially inflate the rights, the value, the transfer rights of players. People are falsifying Wikipedia entries on players which possibly don't exist, we don't know. They disappear, their Facebook profiles disappear, they're then traded into Asia. The clubs may not exist, we don't know that either. It's hard to verify whether some of the clubs do exist. The betting companies who monitor all of this often use Wikipedia to verify some of these entries. The system is completely broken in more ways than one. And I suppose my point is, we're only really scratching the surface. Something needs to be done about this to prevent people falling by the wayside. And for Solidaire, I applaud you, you do very good work. But in terms of South America and Asia, more needs to be done there.
Yeah, I agree. And if you are talking about South America, let me also bring to your attention what is happening in terms of youth development. Look to Brazil. Look to how investment funds, whose ownership structure is opaque, it's not known in most of the cases, not all, but most of the cases, is not known. And the future of youth development in such a country, and I'm measuring my words, is not dictated by the sports bodies, it's dictated by the commercial interests, right? By Mammon dictating the future of youth development in one of the greatest football nations in the world. Is that right? These investment funds probably would say yes. It's the laws of the market operating freely. But sport is not a business, and it's not just a game. It's much more than a game, much more than a business. And that is why you need proper regulation and proper oversight. Regarding the identity, regarding the ownership of all these vehicles that you mentioned, regarding the players, who are they, where they are, what's their identity, what's their real age, which is something that is completely faked in many situations. But you asked a direct question, and I think a direct question deserves a direct answer. What can be done? Let me tell you. What can be done is, first of all, to have a common agenda, a common vision. And that is not the job for only one organization. That is a job, that is a responsibility that must be shared by the sport and the Olympic movement, by the governments, by the relevant public authorities in each country, and by the civil society and the NGOs who are here. And I think also the European Commission has a very important role to play, and UNESCO has a very important role to play, and the Council of Europe. And organizations like Jean-Claude Mbvoumin, who has been giving his chest to the bullets, putting the finger in a very sensitive nerve, which is not pleasant for many. So common vision, common agenda, common direction of travel. Because fragmentation is not an option. Working in isolation is not an option. And I've heard throughout the last few days people preaching about the power of communion of efforts, true partnership. But let's look ourselves into the mirror. Let's look how much tension exists still among certain organizations. A certain feel of territorial imperialism, a certain feeling of self-preservation, who should not exist, because we are too little to win this fight and overcome these challenges, which you have pointed out. So we need authentic team spirit, and we have to unite efforts. If we have a common direction of travel, then we will be more efficient in our action. And I will give you an example.
Sure,
as a matter
Emanuel,
of fact,
because
two examples. One, I mentioned already here. We are working with a number of organizations in order to develop, building on work that has already been done by a number of organizations, but develop a toolkit with best practice on recruitment, training, education, and protection of young athletes. Soon there will be more news about this. We are also working with immigration authorities, and we are launching a pilot project which involves the immigration authorities, the governments, and the sport movement in Portugal, Brazil, and Cape Verde. Because we know this is a very active triangle where players come into Europe from Latin America and from Africa, and sometimes in irregular circumstances. So action is being taken. It's not enough, yes, we agree, but it's already an important step. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question there.
Matthias Fett from Germany. I have a question in the light, to bring maybe something new into this discussion, in the light of the current refugee crisis. There's an example of that a refugee who was, there was this Hungarian camera woman who fled from Hungary to at least then Spain to get a job there as a coach at a Spanish football club. But I think there was a scheme to make his son, who was very talented football player in his own country, come as a 7-year-old or 8-year-old to this club. So my question is, what, because there are no agents involved and so on, so what are your suggestions, or what are the regulations maybe already in power to secure the that this system, or that this refugee crisis is not misused for sport clubs to get minor, to get children into their clubs and to move around these rules?
Yep. Sinan, do you want to start, or Will?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, looking at the regulations, they are quite clear that the transfers are monitored within the transfer matching system of FIFA, and there can be made exceptions when you move for reasons not related to football. So if you're a refugee, this is, I think, a valid reason to move to another country and to be accepted for another club. But if you can't prove this, you have a problem, and then it's such a move is well, in fact, prohibited. So there is, if it's properly monitored, there is a kind of guarantee for against abuse for the refugee situation. But looking at real refugees situations, they can be fit into the system which is currently in operation.
To build on that, because that's also part of my answer as well, I think there are mechanisms in place, there are rules in place. It's a question of how we apply them, or how they are applied by the relevant authorities. And sadly, in the field of football, I think there is a certain degree of malpractice when it comes to applying the rules correctly. And there we go back to the much broader discussion about governance in the world of football, and, for example, a certain degree of political tolerance of, for example, unpaid players, where there's lots of documentation of how many players are unpaid out there, and yet the clubs continue to function because the authorities at the national level have no intention of stamping down on this. It's the same with the issue you describe. If the rules are not applied correctly at the national level by the relevant authorities, then this will continue.
Yes. Please indicate clearly if there's any questions. If not, I have a funny one. There's a question down there.
Thank you. I'm Bob Monroe from Kenya. I can't remember whether it was Will or Macedo. One of you said that 80% or so of the solidarity payments are retained by the top clubs. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, well, there is a notion regarding the transfer system that all clubs benefit from the system in itself, because well, when you see where our players coming from, there's the solidarity mechanism, and when you a player's going up through the ranks to the top clubs, every layer in the system will benefit. But looking at recent investigations by the Institute of CISSS, it proves that 80% of the money remains within the 5 top leagues, and within those leagues, even we talk about the richer clubs benefiting most of the system. So the notion of every club benefiting from the transfer system is, well, in fact, proven not to be true. And that's also something we are concerned about as the players, because as players we also need fair competition and an equal competition. So that's also one of the reasons why we filed the complaint, just to have a revenue sharing at a different, in a different system. That, in fact, every club and every professional club in every country can benefit from the system. And even, well, after we filed the complaint, we saw our social partners coming back to the table, and we are having a constructive dialogue with them, and even with the European leagues, where they now start to realize that they are not only representing the top leagues, but every league in Europe, and they are suffering the most from the financial crisis. So this is also one of the reasons why we filed the complaint.
Could I just do a follow-up question, please? From a perspective of a club in the south, and I'm the chairman of a Premier League club in Kenya, even with the solidarity mechanism there, on paper it looks good, except the clubs in Europe, the top clubs who are taking our players, they have no real compulsion to pay it. You can make your claim, they ignore it, you write other letters. We don't have the resources to hire big lawyers to go after them, and then after a while it lapses. So for that to be effective, move it from the paper into reality, perhaps there should be a rule. What do you think of a rule that says a player cannot be fielded until they provide proof of the payment of the solidarity according to the player's passport?
Well, this could be a solution, but the situation as you described, you don't need a big lawyer to get your solidarity payment, because the dispute resolution system within FIFA functions quite well. If you can illustrate that your player has moved from one club to another, you are entitled to have it, and it might take some time, I agree, but in the end you get your money. And I also see that the system is infringed at some stages by denying that the player was playing there, and especially when the players do not have a passport, it's difficult to get your compensation won. But in fact, the system is quite simple, but well, in order to put some more pressure on it, but we don't see too many situations where the solidarity payment is finally not paid. It takes some time, but that's the biggest problem, and such a rule could speed things up, but we'll consider it.
There's a question there, and afterwards.
Yeah, Christian Ungrue, Bayreuth University, Germany. Well, this is a sports conference, and problematic migration practices are a sports problem, yes. But I fear if we treat it as such, we turn a blind eye to the bigger picture, meaning that Niko stated that there is dependency among young people, and in West Africa we can call it the culture of migration, meaning that young people will try to migrate anyway when there is the possibility. So I fear that if even we can abolish problematic migration in sports, we will just create another pathway for other businesses that might come up. Traffickers are not bound to sports. They will look for another business opportunity, and then another thing will emerge. So how do you see that?
Niko has a question.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. And the experience so far is that migrant football players are really not aspiring to be professional footballers, but really professional migrants. Many stories have emerged of people who try football. That's their first love, or certainly one possibility for them to go up in the world much faster than being a laborer. But if that doesn't work, there are other possibilities. Working at some job, becoming DJs if they're West African, conforming to the stereotype, dealing in drugs, or marrying a European woman to get a permit, and dealing with things on a day-to-day basis from there. I must say that I get a bit worried when We're trying to solve whatever problem we identify by mobilizing immigration authorities, for example. I mean, think of the current refugee crisis. Where would we have gotten at the present moment if, in fact, we had left to immigration authorities to solve the problem? I think Europe would be a much poorer place if that had been the case than it is right now, whatever is being done for those refugees. So I think the criminalization of movement, the carcerization of migrants, I don't think is going to be a solution. I don't think that's going to be an avenue for us to dealing with whatever the problem may be, because authorities like immigration authorities assume that the problem is already well defined, whereas frequently it's not.
Question there.
Hi, my name is Johann Skoczek. I'm from Vienna. Adding to the broader picture, question to the panel, what about the migrant workers that work for the establishing of stadiums, etc., for big mega events? For instance, in Qatar, the International Labor Union said there were thousands and thousands of workers dying in Qatar on building the stadiums and the rest of the infrastructure. What does Mr. Medeiros and the rest of the panel say about that?
Again,
go ahead, Emanuel.
Again, a clear question deserves a clear answer. I think it's unacceptable any breach of human rights, labor rights, children's rights. And they must be condemned, they must be denounced, and problems must be solved. As clear as that. As clear as that. Situations like those that you described happen throughout the history of major sports events in all countries. So it's not just one country in isolation. And it happens even beyond the circumstances that you have described. A few years ago, not perhaps 1-2 years ago, I was absolutely shocked to listen into the news that there were a couple of dozens Portuguese workers who had found a job in the north of Spain, and they were living in containers, in subhuman conditions. And I also have heard a case of Portuguese workers who came to Scandinavia and were also living in the most unspeakable circumstances, in a container, without electricity, without daylight, without the minimum dignifying conditions. So these are truly serious problems. They must be tackled. They must be solved by the, first of all, by the companies that are involved in those projects, and also by the governments. Against that, nothing but the obvious can be said.
Okay, but do you do something against, I mean, ICSS is based in Qatar. Do you do anything against those deplorable situations for the workers? Do you speak up against your own?
We speak in favor of human rights in all circumstances, and we speak with the power of an independent voice. We do speak. So in all circumstances where human rights are being at stake, obviously our voice must be the one that I've shared here. There is no question about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this question the following: the European Commission, we work obviously within the European Union. We cannot solve problems beyond the EU sometimes, but what we can do, if we put together some solid principles, then it's not going to be the first time that Europe exports certain basic principles beyond the borders of our territory. At the expert group on good governance, we're working exactly on that. We're developing guiding principles on democracy, human rights, and labor rights in the context of the awarding procedures of major sports events. So I think it's exactly what you're describing. Now, you'll tell me these are just recommendations, they're just guiding principles. Sure, but it's a first step. It's a first step, and we're working with sports organizations, so organizations like the IOC are involved in this process, and member state experts obviously as well. This should be done by the end of the year. We should have a final document, which then, we're starting to create a blueprint, shall we say, guiding principles, and we build on that.
And by the way, I'm a member of that expert group.
Will?
Yeah, well, you may have noticed that FIFPro stepped in together with the ILO. We had a delegation going to Qatar and having discussions on this. Even the president of the Austrian Federation was in the news for demonstrating against the situation in Qatar. So that is what we can do as an NGO.
So final question from me. So we have discussed this issue about human trafficking. To what extent does football transfer human trafficking? And we talked about the importance of having oversight and knowledge about what kind of industry you're going into. So I would just like to hear what's the basic difference between going voluntarily into the sex industry and going voluntarily into professional sport? Anyone?
I'm not an expert. I'm just an expert in sport.
I'm an expert on sex.
Yeah.
I am. Not on sex trafficking, though. But I think it's a very good question, and I think that it needs to be asked. I think that the boundary, in many cases, is a matter of whatever legislation is. It's not a boundary that is set in that is preset, but one that actually is the result of particular legislation in particular states, whether the sex work is legal or not. I mean, I live in a town in which the sex industry is extremely visible, and I think that we need to actually really ask that question: whether there's similarities, what are the differences. I don't have any definite answer because I haven't done the comparison, but I've thought about it, and that certainly is a very good point.
Jean-Claude?
My comment is not for sex and trafficking. It's just a comment following my colleague's reply to your question about the transfers and all this street around football. I think we are at a stage we need to rethink the football. I'm very happy somebody say, okay, football is fair play, everybody is honest, but when we are looking today, there are lot of problems around football. For example, for the young players, the system of transfer, maybe the regulation must be changed. We need an evolution on the regulation. That means why? That means today you have this Article 19 with the 3 exceptions, but we know that everybody circumvents the exceptions. We have today the recruitment of very young players, sometimes at 8, 9 years old. I think that is unacceptable. I'm convinced that we are at the time to put everything on the table and try to build the football of the 21st century, the protection of minors of the 21st century. Another comment is about the labor, the FIFA rule, for example. Who benefit today with the football? Because today everybody say in sports is the recruitment of the trafficking is very marginal phenomenon in all migrations. I don't think so. Today we have in Africa an informal study we conduct in 2013 shows that about 15,000 of young players move to 10 West African countries every year. So I think it's time to try to talk true, not just communication, because all big organizations, they have big communication department, they have a lot of money, so they can say what they want and try to a kind of veil on to the public opinion. Today we really need the change. I understand that some people talking about fair play, about honesty. Really, if there wasn't a problem in football, today we could not have all this corruption, all these young teenagers on the streets in Europe. To finish my intervention, I want to talk about the migration, the problem of today. We have two points of view. Some people want repression. African, go home. But I think today we need more solidarity, because when we only look about football, the best football is in Europe. The 5 top league, they have much money like us, maybe more than all the clubs in the world. And all this success of European football make that in Africa, today when you have a championship, you have a Manchester versus Chelsea match, nobody in the stadium. I think this is a real problem today if you want to solve the problem of inequality, of trafficking of young players, because football needs to be developed in Africa, and they need money. So today, I think it's important to rethink how to redistribute the money of the world football, because all the continents contribute to the success of football in Europe. And I think we'll have very few young players leaving their country every year. That was my question.
Thank you very much. And with these words, I would like to encourage all of you to inquire further into this field. The definite conclusion from today is that we need to know more about this field. Both we need more journalists, we need more students researching into this field, we need more policy officers, we need more NGOs working with this field. So this is my final words, and thank you very much to all of the presenters for very interesting presentations, good comments. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of the day.